Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 219 part 2. Obviously this is part 2 of the Patreon Drydock for the month, so thanks for sticking around so far and let's get on with the rest of the questions. Daniel asks, thanks to, amongst other things, proximity fuses, radar and a policy of having at least one anti-aircraft gun for every square inch of deck space, late 1944 US Navy anti-aircraft fire had become incredibly effective, to the point that conventional airborne attacks on US Navy fleets required overwhelming numbers to be likely to take out capital ships. If this take isn't complete nonsense, does this mean there was a short period of time where carrier attacks on a US Navy fleet, even by a comparable force, would be unlikely to have much success? Would this still be the case for escorted battleships or ships without aircraft protection? And if shipboard anti-aircraft firepower with that level of effectiveness had been implemented by Japan and the US early in the war, do you think the decrease in carrier effectiveness would have significantly changed how fleet battles were fought? Or would they have stayed pretty much the same with less decisive results and worse outcomes for the pilots? It depends how much the attackers are sticking to conventional doctrine in the face of overwhelming anti-aircraft firepower. Now, in theory, you can just brute force your way through with the kind of numbers that the US Navy was able to put up. So if you put mirror-matched US Navy strikes against each other, then if they're going carrier versus carrier, 1v1, the strikes are relatively unlikely to accomplish all that much. But you don't have to necessarily do that. You can just achieve a concentration of force, because even though by the latter part of the war the US carriers are operating together with a collective escort, there is still matters of distance involved that mean if you have, let's say, 400 strike aircraft and you attack along one axis, as long as you've got enough escorting fighters to deal with a combat air patrol, then 400 aircraft coming in all at once are fairly likely to overwhelm that sector's anti-aircraft defences. And then, albeit with some losses, you are probably going to damage or take out a section of the enemy fleet. Now, whether or not that's sustainable long enough for you to be able to take out the entirety of the enemy fleet is another matter completely, but it's possible to force your way through in that manner. But there's also a few other things. You have things like Franklin and Bunker Hill obviously being damaged during the heyday of US Navy anti-aircraft firepower, and that is due in large part to another element that an enemy might exploit in that time period, even if they have fairly large carrier groups, and that is being sneaky, exploiting weaknesses in the air coverage, whether that be coming in during flight ops on the port side where US carriers had a carrier blind spot thanks to issues with the IFF, whether that be just coming in as a single aircraft, because bear in mind you're not talking about the modern PPI style radars, although to be fair, by the end of the war PPI displays were starting to come in. That's the circular plot with the sweeping beam and the little dots. But even then, with the state of late war radar, sending in single aircraft or small packets of aircraft, especially if you are now maybe flying low below the radar horizon and then coming in at extremely low altitude, that might allow you to infiltrate past the anti-aircraft defences. Bear in mind, with the attacks that I just mentioned, people didn't realise they were under attack until someone looked up and went, is that plane supposed to be there? Question, well, the answer was no, it was not supposed to be there, but it was there nonetheless. And the other element that you have to take into account is night action. Now, obviously, that requires specialist training, that requires a reasonable degree of luck, because there's a lot of the issues that would hamper a fleet's defence against a mass night air attack would also hamper the air attack's ability to find the carriers in the first place. But assuming that they are found in some way, shape or form, although right towards the end of the war, you've obviously got radar-directed fire control for the big guns, for the 5-inch in this case, if we're talking about the US fleet. And whilst a certain amount of radar direction is coming in for the smaller guns, like the 40 mils, there is still an awful lot of manually directed correction going on for the lighter anti-aircraft guns, the 20 and 40 millimeter. And so if somebody has a similar sized force and they train all their aircraft in night action, night attacks, they have an appropriate number of air-to-surface radar-equipped search aircraft as well as night fighters, because of course by this stage of the war the US Navy is also deploying a limited number of night-capable squadrons, then a kind of US Navy style mass attack, several hundred aircraft, probably have to be split into sections to avoid too many mid-air collisions, but coming in, they would, if everyone's on alert and catches them coming in, they would endure a barrage of long-range 5-inch gunfire. But as they close in, and what would happen in the daytime is the 20 mils and the 40 mils would take over most of the killing work, they're suddenly going to find that the effectiveness of the 20 and 40 mils are significantly reduced, which would allow the attack to continue and theoretically get a lot of success relative to what they might get during the day. So the short version, force matchups directly against each other using conventional attack patterns against a late 44, early 45 US Navy anti-aircraft defense is probably not going to work too much, but there are various ways around that if you have the aircraft to pull it off. Paislitz asks, while building a model of Richelieu, I studied the backward firing arcs of the quad turrets. Although the design of the Richelieus is mostly considered to be very good, how big of a tactical disadvantage is the fact that not being able to engage enemy ships in the stern section? Let's say, for example, Richelieu meets up with a superior, equally fast enemy, perhaps Bismarck along with a Scharnhorst, and chooses to disengage. Either Richelieu has to stay in an angled line to use the main artillery, which means not getting away quite as fast as it could, or going in a straight line and not being really able to engage the following ships. Am I wrong here, or have I missed something? The fact that the French reconsidered the turret layout with Gascogne and Alsace seems to strengthen this as a design weakness they'd noticed. Now, there are obviously a blind arc of fire in the aft quarter of Richelieu. However, it's not necessarily as bad as you might think, because whilst a stern chase seems fairly obvious, the fact is that most of the time, in fact the vast majority of the time when it comes to stern chases, to get everyone lined up exactly is incredibly difficult and incredibly rare. Even if you're sailing in a given direction, you don't necessarily want to be sailing perpendicular away from your opponent, with your stern pointing directly at them, because just sailing away doesn't necessarily help you. You want to be sailing in a way that A is going to get you away from them, but B is also beneficial to you. So heading towards friendly forces, heading towards a port, heading towards a fog bank or something else. That's not necessarily going to be 90 degrees away from your enemy, and your opponents may not actually be directly after you in any case, because let's say you're merrily sailing along in your Richelieu class and you suddenly find, as you suggest, a Bismarck and a Scharnhorst coming in, and they are on your starboard quarter at 45 degrees bearing, so they're basically in front of you and to the right. You might then turn 90 degrees or just over 90 degrees and start heading away from them. But if they choose to follow you, if they plot an intercept course, i.e. they're coming, not necessarily straight at you, but at a deflection, then they're travelling a longer path, and your speed, slight speed advantage, will actually tell more. So they don't want to be heading straight at you, or the equivalent of heading straight at you that a deflection interception course would supply. They are probably going to turn to match your course, but in parallel off to one side, and follow you that way. At which point, either they're probably in the rear arcs of your forward guns, or a very slight course adjustment will bring them into that arc. And similarly, if the other thing is, you don't necessarily want to, in a battleship fuel, close down to 0 feet and have a melee fight. you want to maintain a certain distance, and that again means that your opponents are likely to be off to one side or the other. Because the other thing you've also got to bear in mind is that if the enemy's chasing you in a direct stern chase, if they somehow maneuver themselves there, they can only bring a portion of their main armament to bear. So for Bismarck it'd be half, for Scharnhorst to be 2/3. So if they want to fire at you with the maximum number of shells, it's also in their interests to be somewhat off to one beam or the other, so that they can bring all of their guns to bear, which usually would mean that you could bring your own to bear as well. So effectively a dead stern chase is unlikely to happen. But if it does, yes, there is a possibility that you will end up in a position where you can't return fire. But it's the kind of, what are the benefits of the all-forward layout versus what are the disadvantages of potentially being caught in a 1 in a million stern chase. So, broadly speaking, it's not as much of a weakness as it might otherwise seem. Now, when it comes to Gascogne and Alsace, there are two very different factors in play. With Alsace, it's simply the fact that with the number of additional guns they wanted to put on it, you're basically going to go towards a more conventional layout unless you want to replicate Nelson, and doing that with quadruple 15-inch turrets, it might be a little bit of a stretch. I mean, it could possibly be done, but you'd either face the same issues that Nelson faced with Sea Turret, in terms of not being able to fire directly ahead, or you'd have to triple stack them like an Atlanta, which would have stability implications. So given limitations on French infrastructure, it's just easier to go with 2 fore, 1 aft. Gascogne, on the other hand, is a very interesting one, because Clemenceau and Gascogne were both follow-ons, both had their designs chosen at the same time. It wasn't that they went Richelieu and Jean Bart, then we're designing Clemenceau, and then we're designing Gascogne. Darlan actually asked for various options, and he picked 2 different options, one for each ship. Clemenceau being a modified version of Richelieu, and Gascogne obviously being very heavily modified to have 1 quad turret fore and 1 quad turret aft. Now, whilst yes, it eliminates the rear firing arc blind spot, it also means that Richelieu itself can't engage in a more direct stern chase or combat approach, and still be able to use all its main armament, or Gascogne in this case. So, there's losses and gains in that department. The most commonly cited benefits to the arrangement is that it meant that the amidships portion was now much clearer for anti-aircraft firepower, so they could get more efficient secondary and anti-aircraft gun layout. Which, to a degree, okay, fair enough, is true. But I personally think that a good chunk of that was because the French, due to the failure of their attempts at dual-purpose 6-inch guns, were still thinking about secondary and anti-aircraft batteries as separate things. So they had the 6-inch secondaries, and for Gascogne, they were going to introduce a dual-purpose 100mm, which, or effectively, to be fair, anti-aircraft 100mm with a very limited secondary anti-surface role. Whereas if they had used the Richelieu layout of 2 turrets forward and none aft, then if everything was dual purpose, whatever caliber that might be, then I don't think they'd have quite the same issues with anti-aircraft firepower, because the stern area would provide quite a nice anti-aircraft battery, especially with centerline mounted anti-aircraft guns that could supplement port and starboard mounted ones, and you can still come a limited way up amidships to complement that broadside. So personally, I think if the French had had a dual-purpose gun from the start with the layouts, they may well have stuck with the all-forward armament. But, they didn't, and so Gascogne was designed. Peter Guy asks, my father's uncle is listed on his military gravestone as a fireman in the US Navy of World War I, although we know nothing about his service. I know many of the capital ships in the US Navy at the time were oil burners, but what are the chances he was serving on such a ship instead of serving in the naval equivalent of Hades in the coal-fired boiler rooms? Were the oil-fired ships a relative rarity still in 1917-18, which seemed to be the likely years of his service as he was born in 1899? It would depend in great part on which part of the Navy he was actually serving in. Obviously, they're not coal-fired submarines, but if he was serving in the surface fleet, which statistically is the most likely option, then the destroyers are the only branch in which he would be more likely to be serving in an oil-fired ship than not. Because if you look at the US destroyer classes, the first 21 official destroyers, starting with the Bainbridge, not accounting with torpedo boats and so forth before that, are coal-fired. But by mid to late World War One, there's another 40-plus destroyers in service that are oil-fired. So you'd only have a 1 in 3 chance of serving on a coal-fired destroyer as opposed to an oil-fired destroyer. But everywhere else, it's either guaranteed to be or almost certain to be coal. So all of the US cruisers in service at the time are coal-fired. The first oil-fired US cruisers are going to be the Omahas, which aren't in service in World War One. And as far as battleships are concerned, the US moves to oil firing with the Nevada class, as seen here. So if you're in any of the US 12-inch gun dreadnoughts, or you're in Texas or New York, they're all going to be coal-fired. The pre-dreadnoughts are still around. They're all coal-fired. Pretty much all of the auxiliaries, albeit not all of them, are going to be coal-fired. So if you're serving in World War One US Navy and you're in the battleships, you're basically hoping that you get Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, or Arizona, because everything else is going to be coal-fired. And the New Mexicos are only just commissioning, so in theory, if you're in service in 1918 or late 1917, you might also get a New Mexico. But statistically, the number of oil-fired battleships in the total US battle fleet is in the minority. So, yeah, statistically probably in a coal-fired ship, but there's a reasonable chance that he might have been on an oil-fired ship depending on the particular vessel or branch that he's serving in. Connor Johnson asks, to complete HMS Dreadnought as quickly as possible, Admiral Fisher, insert tongue twister here, nicked the guns from the then under construction Lord Nelson class of pre-dreadnoughts. However, the two ships combined only had 8 guns and Dreadnought needed 10. Did Fisher also nick the spares? So it comes down to the fact that the Lord Nelsons were designed with the 12-inch 45 caliber Mark 10 gun, which was exactly the same gun that was used on Dreadnought, which was also exactly the same gun that was used on a number of other ships later on. So orders had been placed for the Lord Nelson and Agamemnon to have their, as you mentioned, 8 guns plus some spares. And then in 1905, orders were placed for Dreadnought to get her guns and turrets, as well as some spares. But because they're all functionally identical weapons, it means that whichever ship they go to doesn't actually matter too much. So the gun foundries might have been producing 8, 10, 12 guns, whatever, for the Lord Nelson class, and they were earmarked to go onto those ships, and then Admiral Fisher turns around and says, well, my new Dreadnought needs 10 guns to start with, plus a few spare barrels, so we're placing the order for those. However, I want Dreadnought to be finished first, therefore any and all guns you currently have in production that are 12-inch Mark 10s are going to Dreadnought first. So it would have been, okay, here are the guns we were making for the Lord Nelsons, now they're going to Dreadnought instead, and the guns that have been ordered for Dreadnought, well, most of them are going to the Lord Nelsons instead, and any sort of intervening overlap, whether that be surplus barrels designed for the Lord Nelsons or the first 2 guns that were actually paid for Dreadnought, depending on what priorities were given, would have then also gone to Dreadnought. It's basically a happy coincidence of the fact they're using exactly the same main armament in terms of what type of gun they're using, which means you can just basically move the post-it notes around for who gets what. Torreno asks, in 1860 the main weapon of a naval vessel was its guns, but by 1866 and the Battle of Lissa, ramming is now seen by many as the principal weapon due to ironclads. I know why this happened, with most weapons of the time incapable of piercing the latest armour, but what was the process by which the ram was reintroduced as one of the principal weapons? Was it something that came about after studies by committee, an ad hoc solution, or were there always advocates for the ram who suddenly had an "our time has come" moment? So the reappearance of the ram came about in stages. Initially, believe it or not, the advent of the ram was, in the modern era, generated by the appearance of steamships on a large scale, because one of the larger problems with ramming with Age of Sail vessels, although it had actually occurred sort of semi-regularly, whether intentionally or not, in the Age of Sail, was that if you rammed an opponent's ship, you needed the weather gauge, you needed the wind to hand, and your opponent could just turn and sail away anyway if they saw it coming. Plus, if you hit something, it was very likely that you would start your own masts and yards, bring down your own method of propulsion, and then you were pretty much stuck. So to get a really effective ram in, you're basically sacrificing your own means of propulsion, and you might not actually disable the enemy's means of propulsion in your ram, because of course if you're moving at 10 knots, then all of a sudden your mast and yards are moving at 10 knots and the rest of your ship isn't, at which point snap. Whereas if your opponent was, say, wallowing at 2 or 3 knots, well, their relative change in velocity is a lot less, so their mast and yards might stay up. But with the steam engine, it meant that all of a sudden, the potential loss of masts wasn't so much of a problem. It would still be irritating, but you could still maneuver. You could also get up to a reliable speed and a reliable course, and a sail vessel might not be able to outmaneuver you at that point. Plus, it obviously, with the additional power of the steam engine, you could fit something that was a bit more suited to ramming on the bow. So people were thinking about it and designing various ram ships, and then as the ironclad age itself dawns, there were already ironclad ram designs being produced, because people had realized, well, this is the next logical step. We don't have to worry about our propulsion being disabled anymore, and now with ironclad armor we can also resist incoming shells, so we can get in close and attack, because that seems to be the only viable method. Because, as you mentioned, if everyone thinks that your shell guns, etc., are going to either bounce off the armour or maybe solid shot at close range will penetrate, but it's not going to do anything like enough damage to stop you, well, significant underwater damage in the form of a ram would be, therefore, pretty much the only thing that you could use to reliably cripple or sink an enemy vessel. Then, on top of that, so you've got everybody thinking at the start of the ironclad age that maybe ramming is going to be at least a useful ancillary, if not possibly a main form of attack. But with the race between guns and armour going up and up all the time, there are obviously people saying, well, armour will always be able to keep ahead. There are other people saying, but we can always build a bigger and more effective gun. So the jury is a little bit out, but people start putting rams on ships mostly as just a form of insurance. And then right at the start of the ironclad age, you have the American Civil War, where a number of successful ramming attacks are carried out. That prompts people to think maybe there's a bit more to this than perhaps we thought before, if they weren't already advocates of the ram. And then it started being deployed on a lot of different ships, which is why at the Battle of Lissa, most ships are going into it with some kind of ram bow already on them. It's not a kind of ad hoc thing. This has been building and building and building for a while, but with Lissa, with the number of ships that failed to get sunk by gunfire and the rather notable sinking by ramming, even if it did take a few attempts, then all of a sudden the ram, which is already present, switches from the secondary or backup weapon to the primary weapon, at least in the minds of some. Jack Devaney asks, my grandfather was a stoker in the Royal Navy from 1946 till sometime in the mid to late 50s. Not sure how he could be a stoker since he served on oil-fired ships. Basically, they just kept the rank the same. I think they're still called stokers, actually. And as a proud Welshman, he was quite good at rugby and boxing. apparently won an Interforces boxing belt at some point in his career. So my question is, how important were sporting activities to navies to keep in terms of keeping up morale and keeping sailors in fighting shape, as it were? And did these activities and competitions continue in times of war? Boxing and other sporting competitions weren't necessarily required to keep the crew in good physical shape. For the most part, life aboard a warship, certainly in the early 20th century and before, is quite a physically taxing work anyway. Maybe someone like a radio operator isn't going to see as much physical exercise as someone who works in the engine rooms, or a gunner who's handling shells all day. But you're very, very rarely going to see a significantly overweight sailor who's become that way due to indolence. And if you do, well, you can guarantee that the petty officers and so forth will find something for that person to do. But it is a useful way of keeping fit, just in case there are a few extra pounds you want to stave off. But the various sporting activities that were organised on ships were in part to encourage people to develop certain skills. So one of the other sporting activities that was quite highly encouraged aboard warships was sailing and or rowing competitions for the ship's boats, and they would then contest against other ships' boats from various fleets, flotillas, squadrons, etc., for various cups and prizes, which of course encouraged seamanship and teamwork. But boxing and a number of other martial sports were encouraged mainly as a form of getting some of the pent-up tension out of one's system. Obviously, there's the health benefits, and it was also held to encourage, at least for some periods of the Navy, to encourage a martial fighting spirit, which, well, would help, I suppose. But you had other activities, like you mentioned, rugby, football, etc., which are more about team building and having fun passing the time. Boxing as well, sort of learning to box and keeping your boxing skills up, it also helps pass the time, which helps men not get bored. And as I said, also all of these sports provide an outlet for tension and energy that people might otherwise build up, being stuck aboard a ship for a long period of time with not a lot else to do if you weren't particularly intellectually inclined and or the ship's library wasn't particularly large when you were off duty. So overall, they were pretty good for morale. Plus, you also had a degree of healthy competition because whilst in a boat race or a football match or a rugby match, you might be competing against other people from other ships. In a boxing match, it could very well be, the gunners versus the engineers or some other variant of things. And if you're on a particularly large ship, like a battleship, it might even be, everyone associated with A gun turret versus everyone associated with B gun turret for bragging rights and so forth. As far as the activities and competitions continuing in times of war, yes, they were maintained. Obviously, you're not going to stop what you're doing in terms of wartime activity for a sporting competition, but there are numerous accounts from World War II, for example, where, say, the Mediterranean fleet pulls into Alexandria at the end of a successful operation. Everybody has a bit of leave. Then everyone's back waiting for the next operation to begin. And while they're waiting, there might be, a quick 1 or 2 day football tournament ashore or some boating going on, and boxing matches and other martial arts and other sort of 1 or 2 person activities are very easy to organise aboard an individual ship as well, just, I say, to provide some entertainment and pass the time. Rodney McCoy asks, what was the Royal Navy's knowledge of the US Navy's battleship development from 1935, in particular their armour schemes for the American fast battleships, the use of super heavyweight armour-piercing shells, and the electricity-generating capacity of American battleships? Now, I don't know the answer to this precisely. Naval intelligence, the details thereof, is not something I've studied in massively great detail. And in the mid-1930s, the US Navy certainly was coming out of a slight period of tension with the British. And, of course, you had negotiations for various naval treaties as well. So I believe, based on the limited amount that I've looked into intel and reports and discussions, etc., that the British knew most of the general particulars. So, for example, they knew that the US had chosen inclined armour for their latest fast battleships. Super heavyweight shells was something that in principle had been discussed for quite a while, and some of those details would have been relatively public because, companies were manufacturing them, private companies, as opposed to being an in-house complete development and production thing. As far as electrical generating capacity specifically, it would depend on how much the Royal Navy knew about the internal layout of US ships in particular. I mean, in 1935, bear in mind, the US hasn't actually laid down and completed any fast battleships, so most of their knowledge is going to be from the earlier US ships, but a good chunk of those earlier US ships have turboelectric drive, so they are, apart from, well, A, they've had 2 decades to work things out, and B, they're going to be aware that US ships are capable of generating a fair bit of electrical whack. Although how much that's going to translate into the upcoming fast battleships and whether that's going to be further turboelectric drive or whether that's going to be generators, etc., I suspect certainly in 1935 was still questions that were being asked. I mean, in 1935, the US was still asking questions about how its fast capital ships were going to be designed. So that would be my supposition, but I do emphasise that that is a supposition. If anyone else has looked into the exact nature of interwar intelligence gathering via different nations on each other during the treaty era, then please comment below and we can all learn something new. Brandon Minders asks, sail ships in the early period often had 4 masts. Later, entering in the classic age of sail, they started to have 3 masts. What is the advantage of this new design besides simplicity and less manpower? Would a previous ship have faced a serious disadvantage when combating ships with this new design? As I understand it, the move from 4 masts to 3 masts on the largest ships of the line came about due to a variety of smaller factors all adding together, one of which was mast and yard and rigging technology evolved, which meant that you could fit more larger sails on your bigger masts, and therefore your total sail area could be met with fewer masts. Another thing was that the stern area, as you can see in this little sketch, on older ships tended to have multiple steps in the stern. There are a variety of different decks, and the relative shortness of a half deck or a quarter deck or whatever, to a certain degree, would limit the size of the mizzen mast because you could only fit a certain amount of rigging at the same level. And so having another Bonaventure mizzen aft would be preferable to not having one because it allowed you to get a little bit more sail area out of the ship. But as the sterns began to flatten out a little bit, so you might just have a quarter deck or a poop deck or something, then not only could the mizzen mast be slightly further back, but it could also be somewhat larger, carry a larger sail area, and therefore it would be more efficient just to have a larger mizzen mast with more sails or bigger sails on it than having a smaller mizzen and then a Bonaventure mizzen, both with, relatively speaking, smaller sails. Plus, of course, as you said, the simplicity and manpower requirements. You can see this when you look at the transformation. So, for example, these might be fairly typical earlier ships, and you can see that both the mizzen and the Bonaventure mizzen are entirely lateen rigged. They have the fore and aft sails, whilst the foremast and mainmast are equipped with square sails. Whereas if you look a little bit forward to something like Sovereign of the Seas, which you might expect to have 4 masts considering its sheer size, well, it only has 3 masts. And when you look at the mizzen mast, it still has this lateen or fore and aft rigged sail lower down, but it also has a square sail higher up because it's a larger mast now, and it can now fit that additional sail for additional propulsion. And of course, as the masts and the sail area that they carry get bigger, they also require more and more rigging, which takes up more and more space, which limits the number of masts you can install per feet or meters of the ship's hull length. And the very last thing is that, again related to the mast getting bigger, there's only a certain limit to the size of mast you can have as a Forth or Bonaventure mizzen mast, because the masts have to be set down quite deep in the ship to avoid them just, wrenching themselves off and damaging the ship's structure. And, well, as you can see again with this kind of diagram, with the very high, very sloping sterns of older ships, you could only get a relatively small mast that could only exert a relatively limited amount of force at the far stern, whereas if you use a larger mizzen, then that's more forward, that can be bedded much deeper in the hull of the ship and therefore can take the strain, and at which point the questionable benefit of a small fourth mast was basically just not worth having. John Plate asks, when Jackie Fisher first came up with his HMS Incomparable, he said it would have had a shelf life of about 10 years. I guess he assumed that other nations would be building things that could surpass it. My question is, what? Did any other nation want to compete with that 20-inch monster? Also, as a side note, how do you think the Royal Navy would modernise it? Well, as hilarious as HMS Incomparable is, it is entirely within the realms of possibility that if she had been built, that and there hadn't been any naval treaties, that Jackie Fisher's prediction would have come true. Because a 20-inch gun is possible. It's at the absolute outer limits of what's practical, and to be perfectly honest, I think an 18-inch gun is a significantly more practical weapon, but if you wanted to have a 20-inch gun, you could do it. But the Incomparable, despite its huge length of 1,000 feet, is actually Panama Canal capable with a 104-foot beam, believe it or not, and it is, quote-unquote, only 46,000 tons. Which means if you look at something like, say, Yamato, which was considerably heavier, or even the Iowas that were a little bit heavier, it is entirely possible to build a heavier vessel. So if somebody was looking to compete with Incomparable, well, the only problem with my first suggestion, which would be to up the armour, would be that if you're going to build it to resist its own guns, it's going to need a lot of armour in addition, which would almost certainly going to result in a drop in speed, assuming you keep an approximately equal power plant. But, with 180,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 35 knots as designed, there's a fair bit of speed to shed before you start approaching even the speed of everybody else's battle cruisers. So you could easily, add enough weight to drop 5 knots, and that would allow you to have a substantial increase in armour. If you're not too worried about Panama Canal restrictions, you might also see people going for triple 20s. Believe it or not, I can see someone trying that. Perhaps even if you want to keep the beam as it is and get triple 20s, you might end up with something like a Nelson arrangement or Richelieu arrangement where you move the turrets further back along the ship so you can use more of the ship's beam and thus fit triple 20s in there. Because bear in mind, Incomparable only has 6 guns, so if you replace it with a pair of triple 20s in a all-forward arrangement and move the machinery and the superstructure backwards, that could actually theoretically fit on the hull form. And you're also shortening the belt quite considerably, which means that you can uprate the armour. So perhaps the next stage of the design would be, a twin forward triple 20 with a shortened belt and maybe dropping the speed to 30 knots, which between the two would allow for an increase in belt armour to a point that, whilst it's not necessarily going to have an immune zone against its own guns at shorter ranges, perhaps at least at over 20,000 yards, it might have something. And of course, armour that has an immune zone against 20-inch guns at, say, 23,000 yards is going to be immune to almost anything less than that you can throw at it. Now, with all that in mind, with your question as how to modernise it, well, it's basically renown on steroids. So if the Royal Navy was going to modernise it and keep it as a gun-based battle cruiser, then, well, basically see renown's modernisation. Square up the superstructure, strip off all the secondary and anti-aircraft armament, and put a bunch of 4.5s in. Although in the case of Incomparable, you could probably put 6 or even 7 twin 4.5s down each side, plus a slew of pom-poms, etc., etc. But, as I've said several times before, if it was entirely up to me, if I'd been lumped with an incomparable as the Royal Navy, my solution to modernising it, especially if I was getting hold of it while it was under construction, wouldn't necessarily be to keep it in its gun-shaped form. I mean, you could, I guess, if you completely redid the engines, then you might uprate the armour, not necessarily, if you're doing a renowned style upgrade, not necessarily to a degree that you can resist 20-inch guns, but if you've just got Incomparable on its own in a treaty-era system, you've only got to armour it against 16-inch guns. So, a mid-1930s modernisation with newer engines that, again, takes its speed down to, say, 30 knots, might allow you to increase the 11-inch armour to something approximating reasonable for dealing with 15 and 16-inch gunfire. But I would be sorely tempted to turn it into a carrier because, well, it's 126 foot longer than a Lexington class. And we know how the Lexington class ended up converted into carriers. And if you've got another 10, 15 years of carrier operational and design experience, so you're doing this conversion in the latter part of the 1930s, you might end up with a pretty impressive carrier. The Wind Thief asks, can you talk a bit about shore-based torpedo launchers? How common or useful were they? I've heard the German cruiser Blücher was sunk in part by shore-based torpedoes at the Battle of Drydock Sound, but I haven't been able to find other battles where they played a significant role. So early on, and certainly in the 19th century, the vast majority of torpedoes that were bought and installed by various navies were actually shore-based torpedoes and their associated launchers. Now, this was because at the time, ships had to approach relatively close to use their guns effectively. The rangefinder fire control revolution of the turn of the century having not yet happened. And that meant that even with the limited ranges of torpedoes at the time, harbours and other places of key strategic importance could be defended by torpedoes, which obviously could have a very devastating effect on ships that were coming in, especially because they didn't really have much in the way of anti-torpedo defences to absorb the impacts. And this is also where you see the first wire-guided torpedoes. So wire-guided torpedoes are not, in fact, an invention of the Cold War or even the late last part of World War II. They are, in fact, an invention of the 19th century, where people could then steer the torpedoes from on shore to guarantee that they would hit their targets or have a better chance of hitting the target. But in any case, in terms of their utility and how common they were, 19th century fortifications, late 19th century, very, very common. They show up in almost any harbour that a late 19th century navy wants to try and defend. As far as use, the flip side is that very, very few, if any, full-on harbour assaults were actually conducted in the late 19th century by full-on, peer opponents, which meant we don't actually have much, if any, data on how they would have performed under their intended use. Once you get into the 20th century, then guns start to, thanks to fire control and rangefinders, extend their range, first beyond the range of the torpedo, and then as the torpedo range increases, unfortunately for shore-based torpedoes, so does the distance that the guns themselves can fire, which means that unless you've got a long lance battery or something, which the Japanese did install a few of, you basically can't do anything with a coastal torpedo launcher if the enemy just wants to sit back and shoot you from a distance. Now, if the enemy wants to come into your harbour, that's another matter, especially if you've got a narrow, confined harbour entrance. But by this stage, people would have made thoroughly sure that every fortification they had was destroyed, or that smaller ships were sent in first to see what they could see and potentially, suppress the any torpedo launchers that had survived. Where they failed to do this, you had things like Drydock Sound, which showed the utility of a torpedo launcher, even a very old one, in very narrow, confined waters. But because of the general lack of major peer-on-peer engagements in the time when ships would have been forced to come into range of the torpedo launchers, we don't really find any significant role for them in history. Albeit that, if the terrain around the Dardanelles, for example, was slightly different, we might have seen them being used in there, because that would have been a classic example of where ships would have been in range if there had been appropriate terrain to install shore-based torpedo launchers. Andrew Dederer asks, I've noticed the descriptions of Buord's torpedo factory describe the factory well behind the state-of-the-art, for one thing far too craft-dependent, in American manufacturing for that time. Was this a case of the technology not really having civilian analogues, and thus remaining static? For instance, there were all sorts of issues, especially cost, with the Poland fire control, yet the US had little trouble copying, or possibly cleanrooming it, immediately post-World War I, likely because the US had a much bigger market for and more advanced manufacturers of computing machines. Whilst fire control was stovepiped to Navy suppliers in the UK, similar things seem to have happened with turbines, with US models adopting concepts from hydroelectric projects in the 1930s. I think part of it comes down to US involvement in World War I and the relatively brief nature of it. Because if you look at the pre-World War I status of things, if you want to draw comparisons between Britain and the US, pre-World War I, Britain got its torpedoes from a variety of places, a number of manufacturing facilities that it ran as a government, and also private, Whitehead torpedo factories. But in the run-up to World War I, with tensions growing with Germany, they decided they were going to centralise torpedo production. They could still source it from other places, but they centralised their torpedo production in Greenock, and they built a factory for this purpose. And of course, during World War I, torpedoes were being expended at a fair old rate, so the factory at Greenock had to be adjusted to compensate for all of that. And that in turn meant that when you got into the interwar period, although the factory was now producing torpedoes at a slower rate, they were still of a size where there was enough room, enough machinery, enough experience to, in theory, go back to producing torpedoes at a more significant pace. And therefore, when tensions started to rise again in the mid-1930s, the factory spun up back up to full speed and then would later expand. Whereas if you look at the US's involvement, obviously they weren't involved fully in World War I for the majority of World War I, and so the Navy, which in and of itself was smaller than the Royal Navy in the first place, wasn't expending torpedoes at any kind of fantastic rate, and so they didn't have a pre-war centralised production facility. The torpedo station at Alexandria, which you can see in this photo, which was then set up in the immediate post-war environment, well, as you can see, it's not exactly the world's largest facility to start with, and it's being built in the context of the US not having expended a huge number of torpedoes in the First World War, and of course in the interwar peacetime period not needing a vast number of torpedoes at any given time. And so between its relatively small size and the incentive that they have for producing torpedoes relatively slowly, because hey, if they don't need huge numbers of torpedoes immediately, then why produce them really fast and really quickly? It's much easier to produce, a torpedo or two a week, at which point you've got guaranteed nice, easy work for basically forever, and you can keep a reasonable number of people on staff, but not too many. So that encourages this kind of artisan craftsman style, hand assembling of each and every torpedo. The problem is therefore twofold, in that when it comes to the US getting involved in the Second World War, they're a little bit later on the uptake that tensions are rising. So whereas Greenock is getting up to speed and then expanding in 1935-36, the increased orders for Mark 14 torpedoes aren't coming in to Alexandria in the US until, well, basically the war's already started in Europe. Near enough as makes no difference. And so they're starting from a much smaller base. they're starting from a position of, well, we've always done it this way, this is the way we will continue to do it. They don't have any prior real experience at mass producing torpedoes, nor even really the space, which is why this facility would end up being expanded quite a lot. But as you can see, that would take a bit of eminent domain purchasing and full-scale construction to go on first, rather than just using other additional space that they had. And I think that all adds up to why it took the US a little bit more time to spin up full-scale torpedo production on the level that they needed, as opposed to the level that the factory was initially either able or desirous of putting out. BFW asks, how were heavy cruisers intended to interact in larger battles that include all types of surface ship classes, from destroyers all the way up to carriers? Were they treated like battle line capital ships, or screens, or something else? It depends hugely on the Navy for the interwar time period, as well as, availability and scale of battle. But if we're assuming a full-scale, the entire Navy is going to war with the entire other enemy Navy in a relatively speaking defined area, the Japanese saw the role of their heavy cruisers primarily as backing up their destroyers and other torpedo craft and punching through an enemy fleet screen in order to deliver mass torpedo attacks to the enemy battle line. So this was largely independent of the main battle line itself. It was an entirely self-contained force. The 8-inch guns would serve primarily to, as I said, penetrate the enemy fleet screen and destroy enemy cruisers, and maybe do some harassing fire on battleships, but they weren't expecting too much out of that element. And then they'd fall back and then reload and, if necessary, provide a secondary force to drop in torpedo assaults and so forth in the final battle. US doctrine was completely different. Very large amount of US heavy cruisers were actually assigned to the scouting force, so again, completely independent of the battle line, but rather than being assigned to break up and break through an enemy fleet screen, most US heavy cruisers were supposed to be escorting carriers, primarily providing anti-aircraft defense, but also anti-surface defense against roving bands of enemy heavy cruisers and light cruisers to protect the aircraft carriers. A certain number of them were also assigned to fleet screen duties for the battle line itself, but the majority of US cruisers, at least as long as the battle force and the scouting force existed, were to be found in the scouting force. And then you get the Royal Navy, which has yet again a different idea about how to use them. The Royal Navy grouped up their heavy cruisers into cruiser squadrons, and they intended them to be used as whole units, at least initially, primarily again as a kind of fleet screen unit, but as a battle fleet screen unit, whereas, as we said, the US ones were somewhat split. The British heavy cruisers, if we're talking about full-scale fleet engagements, were designed to act as squadrons to go and counteract enemy heavy cruisers and obviously light cruisers and so on and so forth, and later on to help finish off crippled ships with torpedo assaults and so on and so forth. But they were not supposed to engage capital ships in straight-up combat unless those capital ships had been engaged separately by other ships, at which point their fire was more of a supporting nature than anything else. Obviously, as time went on, all of these doctrines were revised and changed, and in World War II we see heavy cruisers being used in all sorts of roles, some of which bear some resemblance to their pre-war doctrines, and others are completely different because new doctrines are being developed somewhat by circumstance and somewhat by design. So, for example, in the Royal Navy, after a while you start to see heavy cruisers grouped up with units of smaller cruisers, like you have Norfolk along with Belfast and Sheffield in the Battle of the North Cape. So it's providing a bit of a lead and a bit of heavy firepower for a group of smaller ships with lighter guns. For the US, fleet screening remains a significant role of the heavy cruisers, although they do try to use them as independent forces as well. Around Guadalcanal, that doesn't necessarily work out so well, but they see a large variety of roles. Again, similarly leading cruiser formations, although they tend to be slightly larger, and the distribution of them as fleet screens for battleship forces like Admiral Lee's task forces becomes a little bit more equal once production has gotten up to a rate where they can be deployed in fairly large numbers. The Japanese, of course, they never get their Kantai-Kes, and so their primary design role for their heavy cruisers never gets realised, but they, for the most part, for the newer ones, will still tend to operate them in whole squadrons as part of fleets, although occasionally some of the newer ones and a reasonable number of the older ones will also end up leading independent cruiser formations, again, see Guadalcanal, for that kind of role. Joao Rita asks, regarding Napoleonic-era ships, Royal Navy versus everyone else, I remember once reading that the Royal Navy during the 1810s was using mainly flintlock-equipped cannons, whereas the French and Spanish were still using the old system of applying a lighted fuse to the fire hole. According to the text, this gave the Royal Navy a slight advantage because the flintlock would cause the cannon to fire pretty much exactly when you wanted, whereas the old system would fire a second or more after applying the torch. Because the ship's movement might have swung the cannon up or down from where it was aimed, this impaired accuracy. Does this have any basis of truth? It does. So a flintlock, more properly called a gunlock when it's attached to a cannon, was something that the Royal Navy started to adopt actually before the Napoleonic Wars, before the Revolutionary Wars even, in the mid to late part of the 18th century. And by the time we get to Trafalgar, which is kind of, I guess, the turning point, if you like, and generally considered a good reference for Napoleonic-era ship gunnery, then, yes, as the Royal Navy had far, far, far more gunlock-equipped cannon than the French or the Spanish did. Now, the French and the Spanish were both aware of the gunlock, and they were gradually starting to adopt it, but it hadn't reached anywhere near the same level of presence in their navies as it had in the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy had a significantly greater number of them, and therefore more of an advantage, because as you say, you can near enough guarantee roughly where the cannonball is going with a gunlock, whereas if you're using the old light fuse and retire option, the ship's roll may well send it short or long, or you have to time it, which might delay your salvo from what was ideal, or you have to have some very, very experienced gunners working out exactly when you want the gun to go off, at least at longer ranges. If you're broadside to broadside at 50 yards, it probably doesn't make too much difference unless the weather is very violent. But the thing you've got to remember is that it was very difficult, if not near enough impossible, to refit older touch hole guns with gunlocks. So the gunlocks tended to be newly made cannon, and this is where the Royal Navy again had something of an advantage, because with such a large navy and so many operations and so many guns being fired, they were constantly cycling guns and building new ones. So not only had they adopted it somewhat earlier, but the rate at which they were being distributed through the fleet was higher because of the turnover in guns that they were using. But it wasn't a universal thing. As I said, a ship that was equipped with guns from a while back, or a ship that had received a new batch of guns that were just older because it was a less prioritized ship, might still have the old style of cannon. Whereas if you look at the War of 1812, for example, in the US Navy, they have a relatively new navy, they have a relatively small navy, and therefore having a navy that's entirely or near enough entirely got gunlocks on its cannons for the War of 1812 is a much, much easier job. Whereas when they come up against Royal Navy ships, whilst a good majority of the Royal Navy ships have gunlocks on their guns, not all of them do. Some of the sort of third line ships, especially in the very early part of the war, are still carrying around some of the older guns that are reliant on the old match and fuse technique. Although even then, it's not particularly common. It's just noted as there are a few. But this also demonstrates the transitory nature of technical advantages, because in 1805 the Royal Navy has full-on signals, it has coppered hulls, it has gun locks certainly in the capital ships of its fleet, It has a uniform colours scheme for easier identification and all sorts of other advantages, which the Franco-Spanish fleets and various other fleets are in the process of recognising and bringing in. Carronades is another example. But it means that in the Napoleonic era battles, the Royal Navy has a long list of technical advantages over its opponents, or most of its opponents at least, again with exceptions for relatively small navies which can concentrate these advantages to just as much effect, like the US Navy. But if you look 10, 15 years down the line, once everyone's had a chance to catch up and things are a lot more equal, it's just that, 10, 15 years down the line, the war's over. So, by the 1815, 1820, 1830 period, the Franco-Spanish fleet, or the French and Spanish fleets at that point, they have carronades, they have gun locks, they have a uniform colour scheme, they have signals, flag systems, etc., etc. It's just after the war. 3 Papa asks, please describe a typical convoy run to Malta. If the year matters, pick a month or year. Where does it depart from? Day or night? Why? How many days does it take to get to Malta? Does it arrive during the day or night? And if so, why? How many times will it be subjected to air attack? Are submarines an issue, German or Italian? And is there a time the convoy is more at risk of submarine attack? Well, it's kind of an impossible question because there is no such thing as a typical convoy run to Malta. Because of the ever-changing situation, both in terms of grand strategy and in terms of the tactical limitations and threats, whilst there were fairly consistent small convoy runs to Malta, there were, of course, also the big ones, and the variety of settings is huge. There are a few things that you can draw out, though, generally for Malta convoys. Firstly is that the Malta convoys are usually surprisingly small, 3 to 6 merchant ships at a time, and usually maybe 4 or 5 in the middle there, because that's as much as could be safely escorted, as far as anyone could tell, and even then, obviously, there were losses. And you also had to bear in mind that you had to get these ships in and out of the Grand Harbour. So if you had a dozen, 2 dozen ships clogging the harbour up, then a lot of them would be fully loaded but sitting targets for bombers, which wasn't particularly great. There were exceptions to this, of course. Some of the bigger operations like Operation Pedestal or Operation Halberd would see a dozen plus merchant ships sent in, but they tended to attract huge amounts of enemy attention, which ended up with a lot of them being lost. Another common feature for most of the Malta convoys was that they were exceptionally heavily guarded. So convoys out in the Atlantic or whatever, they might have, some trawlers, some destroyers, corvettes, frigates, etc. Maybe a cruiser or 2 or the odd old battleship riding along if there was a threat from German surface raiders. But when you look at the forces devoted to the Malta convoys, each convoy escort in the Mediterranean was massively heavier. So you would also have diversionary forces. So not just that the convoy escort itself might be many fleet destroyers, a fair number of cruisers, plus relatively often battleships or carriers. But if you didn't have battleships or carriers with the convoy itself, you might well have a force of battleships, carriers, cruisers, etc., conducting diversionary missions to keep the enemy's attention away from the convoy in some way, shape, or form. The convoys could come to Malta from Gibraltar or Alexandria. Quite often they would try and combine these, so you'd have a convoy coming from one direction, another convoy coming from the other, and that would allow them to also pick up returning ships and come back the other way in a very grand and complex operation. Usually the heavier escorts, the carriers and battleships and some of the cruisers would turn back part way, because as you got closer and closer to Malta, you got closer and closer to Regia Aeronautica and Luftwaffe activity, and your course became a lot more predictable because there were limited lines of approach to Malta, and therefore you were more at risk from submarines. There definitely were submarine issues, both German and Italian subs. Obviously, starting off with Italian, the German U-boats showing up a little bit later. You would typically try for the ships to arrive in the evening, if at all possible, because that meant that you'd have a night of, relatively speaking, unimpeded unloading, or if you were attacked, it was less likely to be accurate. But that was very dependent on how things had gone. What kind of evasion had you had to do? Had you been slowed up by ships being sunk and needing survivors to be brought aboard and so forth? And there were advantages and disadvantages either way. So if you had arrived in the evening, then as I said, you could unload and maybe even get out of there relatively quickly and safely. On the other hand, if the last part of your sailing in was done at night and you arrived in the early morning, then you'd have some respite from close-in air attack. But Malta had its own fighters relatively quickly, which meant you'd come under Maltese air cover. So generally it was better to approach during the afternoon when you could be covered by fighters out of Malta and then unload at night, rather than approach at night where you'd possibly be at risk from Mars boats, U-boats, E-boats, etc., and the occasional night-flying bomber, and there wasn't a lot that fighter cover could do to help you. As for when you leave from Alexandria or Gibraltar, that is largely down to a function of when do you want to arrive by and what's the speed of your convoy. People weren't usually too fussed about whether you were leaving at a precise time of day or night. Obviously, the convoy is more at risk of submarine attack at night, and it's more at risk of submarine attack the closer it gets to Malta. But as far as air attack goes, it can be all over the place. Some convoys got by with relatively minimal air presence. It was largely down to if-how and when the opponent air force, whether that be the Regia Aeronautica, the Luftwaffe, or both, noticed them. And sometimes that would be exceptionally heavily attacked, although relatively heavy attacks were more common than getting through scot-free. And when we're talking really heavy, some of those attacks could get absolutely massive, well beyond the scale of any carrier battle that you might encounter outside of, the Battle of the Philippine Sea or something. And even compared to that, the attacks would be more intense because, for example, Pedestal, the big centerpiece, if you like, the combined Italian and German forces had well over 500 to 600 combined aircraft, both bombers and fighters, and that included multi-engined heavier attack bombers as well as the more regular torpedo bombers and lots of land-based fighters. And they came in massive waves one day, then they'd go back, and you'd have another wave show up. You'd have 2 or 3 waves, possibly more, of attackers show up in a single day, but then they'd all go back home, the survivors, and then they'd come back again the next day, and the next day after that, and the next day after that, and so on and so forth, if they could. So you would be subjected to thousands of aircraft attack sorties with some of the bigger Malta convoys. And that's why the Royal Navy had to deploy fighters to Malta, why they had to keep reinforcing the fighters to Malta, and why the bigger convoys had multiple carriers escorting as well. So, yeah, the bigger convoys could get really vicious. The bigger convoys were basically full set-piece battles that just happened to be constantly moving. There were a couple of other types of convoy, supply run, I guess you'd call them, to Malta. So there were ferry flights where aircraft carriers would be loaded up with land-based fighters, Spitfires, P-40s, whatever, and they would sail to within a fixed distance of Malta, and then they'd launch the aircraft, which would then fly to Malta to form part of Malta's air defences, and then the carrier would turn back. So that's not a full convoy run, but the carriers would be escorted. And then you also had occasional deliveries of low-volume, high-value goods, which could be done by individual ships, particularly fast vessels like the Abdiel-class mine layers. And finally, the Burnt Potato asks, have you looked into the Honor Harrington Series by David Webber? For all that I've heard about it, no. I do understand that it is a relatively large compendium of work, and it sounds, people say it's like the Age of Sail in space or something along those lines. It's something I do want to get involved in at some point, but, time and various other hobbies do interfere. I do have a couple of books on audiobooks to listen to at some point, but I also have a fair backlog of audiobooks to get through, keeping up with the Siege of Terror series, the Vaults of Terror series. That's both 40k, basically at either end of the timeline spectrum. I've got Sea Power States by Andrew Lambert, which I'm also listening to, and a couple of other downloads. The Ark Royal series by Christopher Nuttall. I've got up to Invincible on that one, and I think there's one or two others that follow that I also need to catch up on. So yeah, there's a lot for me to keep up with when it comes to audiobooks, but at some point, you never know, I might actually get round to listening to the Honor Harrington series as well, and then I'll be able to tell you what I think. And that brings us to the end of this week's extended Patreon Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, if indeed you have reached the end of this section, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Thanks very much. Bye.